Good morning. There's no question this morning that God has been glorified. I have certainly been encouraged this morning by our worship together. And I appreciate each and every one of you, the men who have led us so wonderfully with reverence and humility, and the way that you have worshiped this morning has been an encouragement to me, and certainly God has been glorified, and I appreciate that. And I want you to know how much I appreciate that. I appreciate the men who have led us so far. Our praise to God together, the sobering thoughts that we had at the table, thinking about that incredible sacrifice, and the opportunity now that we have to study. On a quick side note, before we get into the lesson, I want to say something to John in the company of these many witnesses. During Kevin's remarks at the table, I heard a line that was a most perfect sermon title. I'm going to call dibs on that now, moving forward. Spiritually Photoshopped. What a wonderful sermon title that is. So be looking for that in the coming weeks, Spiritually Photoshopped. From me, not John. I guess he could pull a fast one on me and get it in there, but he's a good man. He's not going to do that. He understands the dibs and how that operates. But it is so good to be with you today. If you've got your Bible open to Matthew chapter 5, or Dudley just read for us, we're going to spend all of our time there this morning. It is a most practical passage, a simple passage, and there's really nothing else for us to do this morning than to work our way through these 10 verses and to make application to those 10 verses, and that's exactly what we're going to do together over these next few minutes as we study from God's Word together. Over the last several months, we have been spending some time, every other week or so, talking about a lesson or a passage out of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And there's a lot that happens in those 3 chapters. But if you are really interested in the big, kind of overwhelming, looking from way above kind of idea about what's happening in these 3 chapters, it is in every way an understanding, or God trying to get us to understand what His desires are for God's people and the character that they would then have. That if we were going to be followers of Christ, there is a certain character that we would showcase. And Matthew 5, 6, and 7 talks about each and every one of those aspects of the character that we need to have as God's people. But what really is interesting and a reality to this passage is that if we would then adopt all of that desire that God has for us, and we would adopt the character that's outlined in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, there is a reality that then in culture, we would inevitably stand out from everyone else in the world. It was a reality as Jesus was physically giving these words at the time that he did, and it is the reality for us even today. That in the year 2024, in the culture of the United States of America, if we adopt the desires that God has for us in regards to the character that we would live with, we will stand out from others in the world. And so we have, as we've worked our way through the Sermon on the Mount, made the point that when it comes to character bars, culturally, the character bar is very low. And there's a lot of people that rise themselves to the character bar of culture. But what we're reminded about here is that God's bar for our character is so much greater than man's, than culture's. Did you catch the very end of this chapter? It's the whammy verse. And it is a difficult verse to wrap your brain around. Easy verse to read. But it is a verse that everything in this chapter, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment, has been working its way up towards. We talk about that bar that is set for God's people. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 48, therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. It's a similar sentiment that we see in other places of the New Testament in speaking directly about our holiness, that we should be holy as God is holy, that we're not looking to compare ourselves to our neighbors or to our friends or to even the people sitting next to you in the pews. We align ourselves to God. And so Jesus says, my followers will strive for perfection, just as God is perfect. That is a whammy verse. And it's everything that this part of the Sermon on the Mount is about. We're at the very end of kind of a section, if you will, throughout this sermon that's given to us, that all begin in a very similar kind of way. You have heard it was said. And then he would give a law or something close to a law, and then Jesus would move off of that. You have heard that it was said. And then he would allude to a law from the law of Moses. But it isn't the law in particular that he is alluding to. He will ultimately be alluding to what has become the perversion of that law from the law of Moses. And we'll see how that directly ties in to our text here in just a moment. 3 questions that we're going to start with, that I want you to answer, and I want you to keep in your head at the very front of it for the entirety of our study this morning. Question 1. If someone insults or laughs at you, how do you respond to that? Question 2. If someone harms you, what is your first reaction? And then question 3. If someone cheats you, what is your desire for them? Now, I want you to keep those questions in your mind. I'm going to give them to you very quickly one more time. If someone insults or laughs at you, how do you respond to that? If someone harms you, what is your first reaction? If someone cheats you, what is your desire for them? Keep that and those questions in your mind, and let's talk a little bit about how it is that God would have us to deal with those situations. And he gives us, in this passage, all of the answers and equipment that we need. We're going to break it up into 2 pieces. Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, and then we'll talk about verses 43 through 48. Even though we're going to look at them in 2 pieces, do not look at them as a separate study. They are tied uniquely together. I made mention that this is a section in which it all in a similar way begins with you have heard it said, and he would be alluding to a law that they would have, but now it has become a perversion of that law. So for instance, I said we were going to stay in Matthew chapter 5, and ultimately we will. You can hold your finger there, but I want you to go back to Leviticus chapter 24. I want to show you an example of how this is working as Jesus shares with us, as he does in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 38, when he says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. He makes mention of that. Well, where do we find an allusion to this idea? Well, let's go back to the book of Leviticus. In Leviticus chapter 24, we're going to read beginning in verse 19, and we're going to go down through verse 22. And now listen to what the law has to say, and then we will talk about how at the time of Jesus there has been a perversion of that law that Jesus is ultimately dealing with. In Leviticus chapter 24, beginning of verse 19, listen to the law. If a man causes disfigurement of his neighbor, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, as he has called disfigurement of a man, so it shall be done to him. And whoever kills an animal shall restore it. But whoever kills a man shall be put to death. You shall have the same law for the stranger and for one from your own country. For I am the Lord your God. Now that is the law given to us here in Leviticus chapter 24. And the essence of that law in every capacity was to point out the idea of fairness, but most importantly, the idea of justice. But by the time we get to Matthew chapter 5, and by the time that the Pharisees have taken the law of Moses and perverted it in a very selfish kind of way, the law now had been perverted to see retaliation or to see revenge as duty bound by the law, and then encouraged men to take vengeance in their own hands. But Jesus calls us to a higher reaction. You see, at the time here, the Pharisees would teach, if someone does harm to you, you are duty bound to then do harm to them. If someone insults you, you are duty bound to insult them. You must take vengeance. You must retaliate, because that's what the law teaches. But that isn't what the law teaches. And Jesus ultimately says, I'm going to call you to a higher place. A selfless love, not a selfish motivation, but a selfless love where the other's benefit is sought first. Easier said than done. I want you to look just in this one section here in verses 38 through 42 and think about the action items that Jesus makes reference to specifically. Verse 39. Turn the other cheek to him also. Verse 40, let him have your cloak also. Verse 41, go with him 2 miles. Verse 42, give to him who asks and to him who borrows. Every single time, Jesus is making the point that selfless love is looking for the other's benefit first. We can break this down even further to think about being slapped in the cheek as an insult, being sued as taking our rights or our liberties away, compelling us to go multiple miles, taking our freedom or establishing in some way, taking advantage of our service to others. That when someone insults you, turn the other cheek. When someone sues you and looks to take your rights, give him your cloak also. We start to see all of these things come into play. Now, what has happened in the past is there has been some who would read a passage such as this in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, and they will look to this section and they will believe it and point it out as some discussion about what a Christian can or cannot do, such as a Christian can or cannot serve in the military, or a Christian can or cannot be a police officer, or a Christian can or cannot defend themselves against an attacker. That's not what this passage is talking about at all. It is more of what I think about myself. What do I think about myself? And that reminds us of other passages, Mark chapter 8 and verse 34, when Jesus says, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. That's what Christ is looking for. He's wanting us to consider ourselves. Well, what do I think about myself? The Pharisees in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, in other sections such as we've talked about already, specifically in the way that they pray and the way that they present themselves in public, it is everything. Self is the most important thing. It reigns supreme. It stands above others for sure, and ultimately even stands above God. But Jesus is reminding us that's not what God is looking for. He's looking for followers with a character that is not selfish, but a character that is selfless. So you look at passages like Mark chapter 8 and verse 34, and you start to understand that self-denial is ultimately one of the identifying marks of a Christian. It's what being a Christian is all about. Denying ourself. Now listen, Jesus isn't teaching here in this passage that evilgoers are to go through life unchecked over and over again. He isn't saying to the Christian that we are to sit idly and passively by while evil triumphs in the world. He is simply getting us and having us to consider ourselves and rid ourselves the desires for retribution, retaliation, and revenge. Because the world's first response, when the world is laughed at or insulted or mocked or harmed or cheated, is retaliation, revenge, and retribution. And Jesus has us to rid ourselves of that. He's looking for us to be patient. He's looking for us to be meek. And maybe those things aren't high priorities to people of the world. And here's the reality. Living a life of patience and living a life of meekness, there is risk involved. And the reason we don't like to live that way in the face of insults or in the face of harm or in the face of being cheated is that patience and meekness, we run the risk of the second insult, the second harming, the second cheating. And our selfishness is the one that pipes up and says, I don't deserve the second one. And Jesus says, you get rid of that. He's not telling us to be doormats for the world, but he's telling us to control ourselves. How do we do that? How do we do something like that? Well, that's when these two sections are tied together. How do we control ourselves and to rid ourselves of revenge and retaliation and thoughts of those types? How do we do that? Well, we do that by controlling ourselves with the powerful love that God has laid us to. And if we're able to do that, we can then rid ourselves of those thoughts. But again, that's tough. You know who knows that's tough? God. Because what's interesting about this next section in verses 43 through 48 is he will provide for us more than just do this. He could have done that. But he provides for us a step-by-step instruction on how to do it. And so all that I have to do is to understand this is what God's desire for me is, and to understand here is a step-by-step equation that I can follow to get it done. Because ultimately, this love, this Christian love, is an act of the will. How do we know that? Well, we know it's an act of the will because Christ commands it. And because he commands it, we know it's something that I can choose. We understand that. Especially when my kids were little. I'd like to think it's still the case. They think it's less the case. But especially when they were little, I had the power, it seemed, to command them to do just about anything. Now, I could have done that. Certainly I didn't all the time. But you tell your kids that they need to do something, but we only do that with things that they can or cannot do. You give them a choice and see how they respond. Never would any of us say, listen, I'm tired of that blinking that you're doing. Stop that. I don't want you to blink ever again. They can't do anything about that. We are built to blink. Or say, listen, stop that breathing. I don't want you to breathe anymore. Stop that. We can't make a choice on whether to breathe or not. It is involuntary. That would be silly for me to do something like that. But see, God has commanded this kind of love. So because of that, we know even loving our enemies is something that we can do. It's something Christ did. We don't have to turn over there, but you can make a note of it. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 10, it's what Paul says specifically. That Christ loved us while we were yet enemies of His. We can piggyback off of Kevin's remarks again at the table. How thankful we are that He loved His enemies enough to give Himself for them. It's powerful love. You want to rid yourself of desires of revenge and retaliation and retribution, desires that destroy us inwardly. You want to rid yourself of those things, choose love. So in this passage specifically, when we understand that loving our enemies is an act of the will, we have this question then, who then is our enemy? And Jesus gives us a list of those things. He says an enemy is one who curses you. Don't think in our everyday vernacular of someone cursing at us, even though that may be involved, but it means someone who speaks ill of you or to you. He says an enemy is someone who hates you, for whatever reason despises you, or most usually who you are. Those who spitefully use you, who abuse you, who accuse you falsely, and those who persecute you. Pursues us with repeated acts of enmity. He says, this is your enemy. And for the Christian, for the one, as we're studying the Sermon on the Mount in its entirety, for the one who is matching their character with the desires that God has for us, we establish the reality that then that will have us to stand apart from the rest of the world. That brings about these kinds of things. Hatred, curses, insults, persecution. God says, love those who do that. Why do we do that? Why do we do that? Well, He tells us why. He tells us we do so because it is God-like. It's certainly the way that Christ loved us, and it is God-like to love this way. We've read already at the end of this passage in verse 48 of Matthew chapter 5, you be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. And secondly, He says you live this way because it is a powerful testimony to others. Because it's so unlike how everyone else does it. And so ultimately for us, how do we do that? It certainly is easier said than done in a lot of ways. To live a life that turns the other cheek, to live a life that gives our cloak, also to live a life who goes to when only asked to go one. To live a life to simply give when asked or borrow, to live a life loving the ones who hate and curse and spitefully use and persecute us. How do we do that? Well, I want you to take note of the 4 very active words that Christ uses to help us through it. He says, number 1, love. Love your enemies. The Greek word here is the Greek word agape, and it is an active goodwill. That's the definition of that word. An active goodwill. It is a mindset that we have towards not just our enemies, but ultimately the mindset that we would have to everybody, our enemies included. That I'm going to have an active goodwill towards everybody around us, even my enemies. But he doesn't just say, love your enemies. He goes on to say, bless. Bless those who curse you. And that, again, by definition, that word means to speak well of or to speak well to. That even in the face of being cursed, to being nastily spoken about, you make the decision to speak well of. That means to them. And listen, brethren, that means about them. You see, it isn't ridding ourselves of the ideas of revenge and retaliation and retribution. If Tim does something ugly and nasty to me, that I hold my tongue and then pat myself on the back and say, listen, that ugly thing that Tim said to me, I'm not going to show nasty for nasty. I let that go. But then at the same time, call Ed on the phone and be like, you won't believe this ugly thing that Tim just said to me. Can you believe he would say something like that? What kind of person does he have to be? Does he know? We are to bless those. Speak well to and speak well about. Thirdly, he says, do good to those who hate you. This idea is taught in both the Old and the New Testaments. Remember when I said earlier that at the similar way that each of these things begin, it is an allusion to a law from the old law, but ultimately it is a perversion of that. And you see that right here. Did you take notice at the beginning of this section? You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. You're not going to find that in the old law. Nowhere in the pages of the Old Testament, in books like Leviticus, where we've already turned, or books like Numbers, will you see a law where God is calling upon his people to love your neighbor but hate your enemy. Now you can find the opposite of that. But now we see a perversion of that, because all throughout Scripture, God is calling upon his people to love. You can find in the page of the Old Testament, love your neighbor, but not hate your enemy. We have perverted that. And so what Christ is telling us, when you have an opportunity to do good even to one of your enemies, do it. Don't let that pass. And then finally, he says, pray. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. What am I going to pray about? Pray and ask God to help them in their life. Pray and ask God to heal the hurts maybe in their life. Pray and ask God to bless them, to have God show mercy on them. Pray. When I was preaching in Louisville, there was an elderly elder who spent time with me often. He had lots of things to say and a lot of quips that have stuck in my mind in many ways, even though it was years ago. And he would say often, and he would make the point often, whether it would be to me or whether it be in general or whether it to be to someone specifically that needed it. When he came across someone, and maybe you're having an issue with someone, whether it be a brother or a sister, whether it be somebody out in the world, when they bring that issue to them, the very first thing he would ask, have you been praying for them? It would almost take you aback a little bit. Have you been praying for them? And then he would go on to say, it is impossible to be worked up over someone that you are actively praying for. What an interesting thought that is. And I would ask him, that's a pretty powerful word you use there, impossible. It's impossible for that. And he says, yeah, absolutely. If you are actively praying for the goodwill for someone else, it is impossible. Impossible to hate them. And Jesus knows that. And he says, you pray for them. And so for us, as we close, if someone insults or laughs at you, how do you respond? If someone harms you, what is your first reaction? If someone cheats you, what is your desire for them? A lot of answers that we could have given there. You need to be honest with yourself. When you ask yourself the question at the beginning of our study, if someone insults or laughs at you, how do you respond? Did you say to help them, to love them, to pray for them? If someone harms you, what is your first reaction? Was it to do good for them? To pray for them, to help them? If someone cheats you, what is your desire for them? Goodness, blessing? You see, Jesus says those are to be our reactions. Easy to read, to comprehend, but difficult at times to apply. But yet it is something commanded of us. And so that tells me it's something God knows that I can do. Will I then control myself to fulfill his desires for my character, or will I not do that? I guess ultimately that's the question of the morning. Interesting things to think about, to apply as we move deeper into the week. I know I keep going back to Kevin at the table, but he made reference even to if there is someone, even here, that you have issues with, and you're just unwilling to resolve that, that's going to make a difference here as we've surrounded the table. It's because his desire for us is to be actively loving them. We choose to do that or not. God's call for us is high. His bar is high, but again, he knows that we can reach it. Decision, yes or no. Follower of his or not. And as Tim leads us in the song of invitation, it gives us that opportunity to be thinking about those kinds of things. To be thinking about the decisions that we're making, the relationships that we have, the way that we respond in these situations where we are called upon to love our enemies, most certainly, because Christ loved us. gave himself for us, sacrificed himself, shed his own blood, so that these sins which separate us from God can be forgiven. We can have a relationship with him. That's a decision we can make. Having a good relationship with God. It should be the decision that all of us are thinking about as we sing this song. And maybe a decision needs to be made to repair or even begin that relationship. And maybe we can help. If we can, you let us know as we stand and sing.